You remember this ad, right? Early 2000s Zoloft commercial? It's a classic. You have this blob depressively blobbing around, a whole long list of vague symptoms, this inclination that you know when you just don't feel right, before being given a description of how depression apparently works through a chemical imbalance in the brain.
While the cause is unknown, depression may be related to an imbalance of naturally occurring chemicals between nerve cells in the brain.
And then an explanation of how taking Zoloft will fix this chemical imbalance and make you less depressed. We then see the blob happily blobbing around, flying around with ladybugs, before a long list of side effects is read to us.
Side effects may include dry mouth, insomnia, sexual side effects, diarrhea, nausea.
The ad then ends with a call to action to talk to your doctor about Zoloft, before ending with this line.
Zoloft. When you know more about what's wrong, you can help make it right.
It's a really well-made ad. You can pretty much understand what it's trying to say even without the voiceover. And with the voiceover, you get these overly broad symptoms that could apply to just about anyone. You get a call to action to talk to your doctor about Zoloft, and you get the side effects being read off in this sleepy voice while the blob floats around with butterflies, making you completely not pay attention to what's being said. And it even throws in a neat little explanation of what causes depression: a chemical imbalance. A phrase that would form the basis of all of Zoloft's marketing at the time, being repeated in their ads for anxiety and PTSD. And I just want to briefly pause here to talk a bit about these ads, because I haven't seen them in a long while and they're kind of wild. The anxiety ad drops some deep blob lore, with the revelation that they turn pink when anxious, and that they live in these strange houses devoid of furniture, and form conga lines at their blob parties. Which, of course, needs to be taken into consideration with the later depression ad, which shows a blob living in a cave. So is the anxiety house just a meeting place? Or do some blobs live in houses, and some in caves? Is there wealth inequality between these blobs? Is there a class system? What is really going on in blob society? And then there's the ad on PTSD, which is just kind of bad and weird, even for a pharmaceutical ad. It just seems kind of tone deaf to me. Although it does insinuate that blob society is not all conga lines and parties, and that there is some pretty traumatizing stuff there. And why wouldn't it be? It's true, right? This was at least how mental illness was presented to me in undergrad, where I majored in psychology and minored in chemistry. All mental illness, but especially depression, was framed as being caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. In depression's case, serotonin. And this might have been how mental illness has always been presented to you. It's a theory that holds a lot of sway, and has held a lot of sway for a long time. You see references to it everywhere, in textbooks and TV shows,
Maybe you got a serotonin problem.
in YouTube videos and news stories, and of course in pharmaceutical advertisements as well. In fact, a study from 2007 showed that 54% of people thought of the chemical imbalance theory as being the primary cause for depression. And another study in 2025 found that 40% of people thought that their depression was definitely caused by a chemical imbalance. And all of this despite this theory just really not holding up to scrutiny, essentially from its inception. Yes, despite many media reports saying this theory was killed in 2022, this theory has not been provable and has been largely debunked for far, far longer than 4 years. And so how did we get here? Why did this theory become so popular? And why is it wrong? How did we get to the blob? And where did this idea that mental illness is caused by a chemical imbalance originally come from?
Depression may be related to an imbalance of naturally occurring chemicals between nerve cells in the brain. You know when you just don't feel right.
Now, it might be worthwhile to go through the entire history of mental illness, or at least as much as we know, and all the treatments for it, but that would take a while. Essentially, as long as there have been humans suffering from some kind of mental illness. And as long as there have been humans with mental illness, there have been different explanations for what causes mental illness, and different ways to treat those mental illnesses. And what actually qualifies as a mental illness is something that can change pretty radically over time and across cultures. This all makes it rather difficult to give all of the precedence to an early 2000s Zoloft ad. To keep it simple, this theory saw its genesis in the 1950s. Although earlier theories of a biomedical model of mental illness did exist, such as with Emil Kraepelin, who saw mental illness as being caused by exclusively biological causes. At the time the theory was originally created, in the 1950s, most in vogue explanations for mental illness were divided between Freudian views and behaviorist views, both of which focus on the role of life experiences in creating mental illness, and especially from a Freudian point of view, traumatic life experiences. Treatment for mental illness at this time, no matter what theory you ascribed to, was largely focused on talk therapy. There were a few physical treatments, such as the ever-present electroshock therapy and the not-so-ever-present lobotomy. Now, some medication did exist at this time to treat mental illness, but in the form of drugs targeted at the symptoms of mental illness and not the core itself. These largely took the form of barbiturates, because you can't be mentally ill if you're zonked out all the time, and amphetamines, because you can't be mentally ill if you're always manic. An important note is that these drugs were largely marketed at housewives, as mother's little helpers, and, as a topic for a future video, largely served to control women to align with the values of a strictly patriarchal society, something psychiatry has a long history of. This supposedly changed with the synthesis of chlorphrazamine in 1950, otherwise known as Thorazine, the first of the first generation of antipsychotics, which, it's important to note, Thorazine wasn't originally seen as an antipsychotic. Originally, it was seen as a tranquilizer, but eventually it was given the title of antipsychotic as the term tranquilizer largely fell out of vogue when describing psychiatric medication. Thorazine was and is still seen as a major step forward in psychiatry. Although its mechanism is still unclear, it does seem to significantly decrease the amount of psychotic symptoms a patient has. And it's relatively safe, especially compared to barbiturates, which had been prescribed earlier. This safety allowed for it to be prescribed in outpatient settings, which eventually led to deinstitutionalization and the death of more physical treatments like the lobotomy and the insulin coma. Thorazine and its subsequent explosive success ushered in the golden age of psychopharmacology. Suddenly, with the introduction of this one medication, it seemed that mental illness could be treated with just a few little pills. And so, it was during this golden age that we saw the development of the first antidepressant, iPronazid. iPronazid was originally developed as a treatment for tuberculosis, something it was apparently pretty effective at, before it was noticed that it caused a state of euphoria and hyperactivity in patients, which is a pretty far cry from how tuberculosis patients usually are. This led to it being repurposed as a psychic energizer, a term seemingly chosen to differentiate it from other stimulants, which had become popular with the Beat generation. The specific reasoning for this term was that it stimulates the mind and not the body. Is this true? Probably not. IPronazid is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, or a MAO-I for short. Monoamine oxidase is an enzyme that breaks down various monoamines, such as norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. By inhibiting this enzyme, the levels of these monoamines was supposed to increase in patients, leading to positive effects on mood. At the time, the main culprit for this drug's effects on mood was norepinephrine, which is the neurotransmitter largely responsible for a lot of excitation and movement in the body, and is what is primarily acted on by stimulants. And so, maybe you can start to see where the building blocks of the chemical imbalance theory come from. But MAO-Is and iPronazid would not remain the star of the show for long. You see, iPronazid did seemingly energize people, and made them feel less depressed. But it also caused severe liver damage, which made it quickly fall out of favor, and for it to be banned in pretty much every country, except France, strangely enough, until 2015. Maybe the French have extra strong livers? And this became the case for most MAO-Is too, which, although they're still around in various forms, have largely taken a backseat to other medications, due to their propensity for causing liver damage. In their place comes imipramine, which, like iPronazid, was not originally developed to be an antidepressant. Imipramine was originally developed as an antihistamine, but it just so happens to be chemically similar to Thorazine, the antipsychotic mentioned earlier. This similarity was noticed by a Dr. Roland Kuhn, who then conducted a study to see if imipramine could replace psychotic patients' Thorazine as a cheaper alternative. And so patients who were taking Thorazine suddenly had it replaced with imipramine. And for the most part, their schizophrenia symptoms came right back. You see, imipramine is a much weaker tranquilizer than Thorazine. However, something Kuhn noted was that the patients seemed to be very elated after taking the imipramine. Seeing this, Kuhn shifted gears and created a new study in which he gave imipramine to his patients who had depressive symptoms, and apparently achieved miraculous results. Despite some questionable methods used in these studies, the idea that imipramine helps alleviate depressive symptoms was hugely influential, and it was on the back of these supposedly miraculous results that imipramine became the first proper antidepressant and became mass-marketed and prescribed as such. It became the first in a new generation of drugs used to treat depression, the tricyclic antidepressant, named for their three-ring structure. Much like ipronoside and amphetamines, tricyclic antidepressants were largely thought to work at alleviating depressive symptoms by increasing the amount of norepinephrine in the brain, largely by blocking its reuptake. And so now, you have three drugs that all supposedly alleviate depressive symptoms, and all apparently work on the same neurotransmitter, norepinephrine. This is how you create a theory. It was seemingly true that more norepinephrine makes you less depressed. And so, is it too radical to believe that the opposite could be true? That less norepinephrine makes you more depressed? This was the idea of Dr. Joseph Schildkraut's 1965 article, The Catechloamine Hypothesis of Affective Disorders, an article that serves as the herald of the chemical imbalance theory. Schildkraut proposed that the cause of depression was a lack of catechloamines in the brain, specifically norepinephrine. Therefore, these drugs work by tackling the core cause of depression. This theory is working backwards from cure to disease. And disease is an important word here. Framing depression as the result of a chemical imbalance frames it exclusively as a disease. It is the full movement away from earlier models based on traumatic experiences into one focused entirely on biological causes. Schildkraut wasn't the first to view depression this way. Of course, as mentioned earlier, Kraepelin had a similar theory on biological causes of mental illness, and the supposed effectiveness of non-talk therapy treatments, such as electroshock and the lobotomy, was already moving a certain portion of the psychiatric establishment towards a biological etiology of mental illness. However, the proliferation of medication and the chemical imbalance theory gave a very clear mechanism of action of the cause of mental illness. The chemical imbalance theory reified the use of medications in the treatment of depression. You had both a cure and a disease, both of which fit together like two puzzle pieces. And it couldn't have come at a better time for psychiatry. You see, the field was in a pretty controversial place going into the 60s. There was a growing sentiment among the public that the aforementioned physical treatments were cruel and barbaric, and they were. And among the medical profession, psychiatry had largely become a black sheep. It was a field focused on things that largely are measured subjectively, and was as much philosophy as it was physical medicine. The chemical imbalance theory supposedly fixed these issues. Suddenly, there was a clear, physical mechanism for why people were mentally ill, and there were medications to be prescribed for that illness. Psychiatry could move away from discussions of the id, ego, and superego, and towards ones of neurotransmitters. This allowed the chemical imbalance theory to soar in popularity and become the go-to theory for why mental illness occurs. And this had another big boon for psychiatry. It allowed the embedding of the pharmaceutical industry into the psychiatric field. Previously, the only medications prescribed were those benzos and amphetamines that only treated the symptoms of mental illness. Now, apparently, medication could tackle the root cause of mental illness. This meant that the pharmaceutical industry could move from just being a side player in psychiatry to the star of the show. And coincidentally or not, these medications came with not only a different etiology of depression, but a different definition of depression entirely. Before the advent of antidepressants, a pathological depression was uncommon. Most of psychiatry was focused on treating various neuroses. And now, depressive symptoms could be a result of a neuroses, or as the result of a manic depressive disorder. But depression itself didn't constitute its own diagnosis, which is reflected in the first edition of the DSM, where it's only mentioned in the context of other neuroses and manic depressive disorder. Under a psychoanalytic model, unhappiness was, well, ordinary. Even the goal of treatment, according to Brewer and Freud. Antidepressants changed this, creating a new disorder. One that, like the chemical imbalance theory itself, was created backwards from its supposed cure. The collection of symptoms that were supposedly treated by antidepressants became what constituted depression itself. This is reflected in the emergence of depression rating scales, which provided objective measures for diagnosing depression. and reflected the symptoms targeted by antidepressants. Unhappiness hadn't become any less ordinary since Freud. However, now that ordinary unhappiness was pathologized, a lot more people had pathological depression, which created a massive market for antidepressants. And so, post the introduction of antidepressants, psychiatry suddenly found itself with a new influx of money, a new disease to treat, and a whole new way of looking at mental illness. Psychiatry was starting to move from using the couch to the prescription pad. Now, before the 1960s came to a close, the chemical imbalance theory of mental illness would morph into its more familiar form, exchanging norepinephrine for serotonin, and another monoamine supposedly affected by antidepressants. This change came with a Dr. Alec Copen, who, through his research, found an apparent lack of antidepressant effects when patients were given Dopac, which is a norepinephrine precursor, and found an apparent increase in antidepressant effects when those patients were given tryptophan, a serotonin precursor. It did not take long for this theory to overtake the earlier norepinephrine one, and become the dominant theory of depression among psychiatrists. The dominance of this theory led to the development of drugs specifically made to target the serotonergic system, the SSRIs, or the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. The first of these drugs was zimeldidine, which was introduced in 1981 and taken off the shelves in 1982 because it caused Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is just kind of weird. So I just want to pause here and expand on this a bit. Guillain-Barré syndrome is an autoimmune disorder in which the immune system attacks the peripheral nervous system, causing weakness and paralysis. It can be life-threatening, but in most cases it is treatable and goes away after some time. Why zimeldidine caused it is unknown. Something about the drug led to the immune system to see the nervous system as a threat. The actual number of cases of zimeldidine causing Guillain-Barré are few, but it was deemed too much of a risk and led to the drug being pulled from shelves. The next attempt to make an SSRI was far more successful and led to far fewer cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. And that was the synthesis of fluoxetine in 1987, better known as Prozac. If the psychiatric establishment had largely bought into the chemical imbalance theory in the 1970s, the general public largely bought into it in the 90s, the age of Prozac. Buffeted by the deregulation of direct-to-consumer advertising, Prozac was a runaway success. Think pieces, books, and movies abounded. It became more than just a drug, it became a cultural juggernaut.
It's like everyone's doctor is dealing with stuff now. Sometimes it feels like we're all living in a Prozac nation.
And beyond just curing depression, Prozac, and some of the SSRIs that followed it, such as Zoloft and Paxil, became to be reframed as being able to make people better than well, to be able to completely reinvent your life, to make you a better you, all by increasing the amount of some molecule in your brain. And the chemical imbalance theory would not just be used to describe depression. Its popularity led to it being applied to all sorts of other mental illnesses, from anxiety to bipolar to PTSD, all the way to eating disorders and substance use disorders. It was on the back of this theory that the biomedical model of psychiatry, one that posits that all psychiatric illness is the cause of biological deficits, was able to take hold and become the dominant theory of psychiatry that we still see today. And so, this is how, in the early 2000s, we get that Zoloft ad with the blob. The ad that tells us that our depression, our anxiety, and our PTSD may just be the cause of a chemical imbalance in our brain.
I'm happy man, can feel it inside.
There is something very nice about the chemical imbalance theory and biomedical explanations of mental illness. They're simple, they just kind of intuitively make sense. They help make something that was previously attributable to spirits and unresolved childhood trauma into something that falls within modern science, something that appears much more treatable. They make complex psychological issues into diseases, physical ailments that just happen to manifest in ways that we would consider mental. However, there is one big issue with the chemical imbalance theory and most other biomedical theories of mental illness. They just lack really any support. There is a lot of bad science and wild justifications that go into propping up this theory. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the theory itself. Roland Kuhn's studies on imipramine, that first antidepressant, were bad, like really bad, as put in Braslow and Martyr's History of Psychopharmacology. Kuhn's careful clinical observations of imipramine's antidepressant properties would have failed to meet any of our contemporary standards for clinical trials. He had no control group, he utilized no rating scales, and he was not blinded to the treatment. He also lacked informed consent and only reported positive results. This would not pass the muster today, and would have a hard time being published in any journal. And this actually extends to his initial observations as well. I'm sure that when he took psychotic patients off of their Thorazine and gave them imipramine instead, they were elated. They went from being on a pretty strong tranquilizer with Thorazine to one with little to no sedating effect at all. I think that would make anyone elated, but I don't think it speaks to the quality of the medication itself. Something interesting is that Kuhn admitted to many of these mistakes later on, and yet still he's held in hagiographic terms by many psychiatric researchers. He's seen as a pioneer who cracked a few eggs but still made an omelet. And the chemical imbalance theory is just that, a theory. It doesn't need to be based on anything other than some observations. Although these observations are awfully flawed, at least until it's disproven. But here comes the issue, is that the chemical imbalance theory has largely been disproven, and is largely considered bunk, and has been for a long time. Despite this, it still holds a lot of relevance today. Without getting too much into the chemistry of it all, I do briefly want to describe why this theory is bunk. For this, I'm primarily going to be using two different articles. Lacasse and Leo's 2005 article on the serotonin theory of depression, and Moncrief et al.'s 2022 analysis on the same subject. I'd recommend giving both a read if you have the time. They're linked in the video description. I also want to point out that neither article was new or revolutionary when it came out. This theory has been in question since at least 1987, if not far before then. Both articles largely focus on depression. And this is because the theory is most commonly associated with depression. However, this is not the limit of the chemical imbalance theory. And as shown in those Zoloft ads, it has been applied to many, many other mental illnesses. The first issue to discuss arises from the theory being created by working backwards, from cure to disease. You see, these medications increase serotonin, and they seemingly make you less depressed. Therefore, low serotonin must be behind depression. This seems all fine and good until you take a look at the research and realize that many, many things that have no effect on serotonin levels, such as taking St. John's wort or exercising, affect depression as well. And that medication that does affect serotonin levels may not actually be as effective as it's commonly proposed to be, with many medications failing to outperform active placebos in trials. If depression was just the result of a serotonin imbalance, then these medications that increase the amount of serotonin in the brain would have miraculous results. Tryptophan studies, one of the reasons for the switch to serotonin from norepinephrine, also don't seem to hold much water, with studies finding generally no difference in reported levels of depression between participants given a drink that depletes tryptophan and participants given a drink that does nothing at all. Given that tryptophan is the precursor to serotonin, depleting it should deplete serotonin, and under the chemical imbalance theory, should make you more depressed, but no dice. And so you may ask, why don't they just measure the serum levels of serotonin in someone's brain, and see if lower levels of serotonin are associated with higher levels of depression? The answer is both that they can't and that they have. They can't because needles and brains don't usually mix. And scientists are not out here trying to give people accidental lobotomies. You have to pay for those. And they have because you can measure the breakdown products of serotonin in the spinal fluid. However, these studies involve a spinal tap, which, if you have ever had one, is not a pleasant experience, and can actually be a potentially dangerous experience, opening the door for infection and all kinds of other harms. This has made them pretty uncommon in the research literature. However, in the studies that do actually test the breakdown products of serotonin in someone's cerebrospinal fluid, they find a difference, with lower serotonin levels being associated with depression. Case solved. This whole video was pointless. Thank you for watching. Wait just 1 second. So while some studies have found differences in serotonin levels between participants who are and who are not depressed, that difference is not statistically significant, and seemingly falls away when you compare participants who have never taken an antidepressant. So this seems to point more towards antidepressants having a long-term effect on serotonin production, which was never really in question. And, well, that's a summary of a lot of the research. It does raise a lot of questions. Namely, how do antidepressants work? And apart from the idea that they might not work, there have been some theories proposed on their mechanism of action. Moncrief, in her 2025 book, suggests that they work not by correcting an imbalance, but adding something. A dulling effect on life, one that might make depression more bearable, but not any better. Along with this, the placebo effect is a ever-present, popular explanation for the effects of antidepressants. Another proposed explanation is that antidepressants increase neuroplasticity, or the creation of new neurons. The idea is that people who are depressed have an impaired ability to create new connections, and antidepressants fix this. This sounds familiar. The evidence is kind of all over the place on this one. With no real evidence that people who are depressed have impaired neuroplasticity, and with some studies showing increased neuroplasticity on antidepressants, some not, and some showing that consistent elevated levels of serotonin could impair neuron generation. Overall, although there is still some question about how exactly antidepressants work, or if they work at all, the evidence is overwhelmingly against depression being caused by any sort of chemical imbalance. Yet, it is still a popular telling of mental illness. It is still told to patients by their psychiatrists. From my own personal experience, working in clinical settings, I have heard this theory everywhere, from my patients to other clinicians. Why? Why has this stuck around for so long?
I'm happy man. Can feel it inside.
Well, it's simple. It's easy to understand. It provides a clear explanation of why you are depressed. It is just like the blob told you. Your chemicals are imbalanced, and therefore you are depressed. It makes something horribly complicated into a simple equation. Of course, it's more than that too. While it's not required for antidepressants to work, it certainly makes them easier to swallow. It gives them a clearer mechanism of action, one that is curative and not additive, one that tackles the root cause and not just the symptoms. This is probably why the refrain about mental illness being a chemical imbalance is so popular in drug commercials. If it serves to completely solve the underlying problem, it's a whole lot more marketable. Which, I don't mean to be too cynical about pharmaceutical companies. Lord knows they have feelings too. But it does seem a bit evil to perpetuate this myth, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. It's a myth that makes people feel like they're broken, that they require a medication to be quote-unquote normal. And this medication is not something benign. It's something that comes with a host of side effects. Side effects that people believe they have to simply bear through in order to experience the life that everyone else is experiencing. Anecdotally, I've been told by one of my patients about the despair that she felt at the prospect that she would never be normal without medication, and her fears that the therapy that we were doing would not solve the quote-unquote chemical imbalance in her head. And this goes beyond just anecdotal evidence, with a meta-analysis finding that chemical imbalance beliefs are associated with higher levels of pessimism about treatment and higher stigma towards those who are mentally ill. But it goes beyond that. It helps obscure what actually makes someone depressed. Under the chemical imbalance theory, depression and mental illness as a whole becomes an abstraction. Despite this theory giving mental illness a strictly material explanation, it operates on an almost immaterial framework. These chemicals are not something that you can see with the naked eye. And without a background in biochemistry, the actual mechanism of how they work might as well be the doings of a wizard. This then promotes a view of mental illness divorced from reality, where it is something entirely internal, instead of the truth, where mental illness is largely caused by external factors, whether it be from a traumatic experience or just general melancholy at the state of things. With this theory, it is not the abuse that makes you mentally ill, but your genetics. It's not the failings of late-stage capitalism making you depressed. It is the chemicals you were born with. As mental illness is removed from its context, it becomes something similar to what Marx described with commodity fetishism, in which a product is divorced from the means used to create it, and assumes a value only related to its use value, or its relation to other products. In this case, mental illness becomes defined and understood only as a collection of symptoms. You feel tired all the time, sad, hopeless, and may lose
interest in things you once loved. You may feel anxious, can't even sleep. Your daily activities and relationships suffer. You know when you just don't feel right.
This focus on symptoms creates a singular depression. Quoting from a quote from a psychiatrist from a New Yorker article, many depressions are given a medical name by a psychiatrist. ascribing the problem to chemistry and neglecting the context and specificity of why someone is having those particular life problems at that particular time. This also narrows both the view of what is abnormal and what is normal. Long gone is Freud's ordinary unhappiness. As mentioned earlier, this theory is partially responsible for the pathologization of states that were once considered normal. The baseline for what is considered ordinary has been shifted to an ideal, where emotions are never felt too strongly, and if they are, never felt for too long. With this, you start to lose the individuality of people. Everyone's baseline becomes the same. Everyone is now expected to meet societal expectations of what is considered normal, creating a world where, again, quoting from the same New Yorker article mentioned earlier, it becomes possible to think of emotional suffering as relapse, instead of something to be expected from an individual's way of being in the world. This abstraction of the origins of mental illness then becomes a powerful tool in maintaining the status quo, which is often responsible for the mental illness in the first place. Why would you bother to change things when the issue is not the society around you, but the invisible chemicals in your head? And the solution is not changing things, but rather it's taking medication. This move away from context can also obscure and prevent people from exploring parts of themselves, with conflicts and ennui deriving from a lack of meaning in life being attributable to some nebulous chemical imbalance. For this video, I reached out to a number of people on Reddit for their own personal experiences with this theory. One of their respondents sums it up pretty perfectly. I'm queer and non-binary, but was raised to believe I'm a straight woman. So life just always felt lacking to me, which gets read as depression. Antidepressants didn't fix that. Understanding who I am and changing my life to be more meaningful to me, that's what fixed my depression. By rooting the apparent mechanism of mental illness entirely in biological causes, mental illness is afforded a sense of permanence. Mental illness is a product of human biology. Mental illness, our current understanding of mental illness, as a genetic constant. This biological view not only forecloses the etiological context of mental illness, but also the relativistic context as well. Mental illness develops a static quality. It can no longer be defined by what is and is not a cultural norm. It just is. It is defined by something far deeper, a chemical imbalance in your brain. On an individual level, this theory perpetuates an idea that mental illness is never transient, but always permanent, which then creates a view that someone should take psychiatric medication for their entire life, which can lead to long-term disability and is unsupported by any research, with most studies only lasting for a couple of weeks. At the same time as the causes of mental illness become ephemeral, putting the blame on a chemical imbalance reifies psychiatrists' role in society as the problem solvers, the sole group who holds the magic bullet to all of society's problems, and the only one who can fix them. Society's problems are suddenly reframed in a way that prioritizes mental illness. Homelessness, not the result of people being without homes, but instead the result of mental illness. Mass shootings, not the result of relaxed gun laws or a violent culture, but mental illness. You feel sad because the world is dying, fascism is on the rise, and you'll never own a home? All of that is not important. You're just mentally ill. The solution to all of these problems is supposedly medication. Now, I want to say that psychiatry is a field that does a lot of good, but it is not the end-all be-all of solutions. And it may not be universal, but most psychiatrists I know have a lot of disdain for their role as psychopharmacists, and this idea that somehow they're supposed to solve the world's problems with a 15-minute session and a prescription pad. A large part of this disdain is that by moving into becoming psychopharmacists, psychiatry has moved away from many of the tenets that make it unique and special, namely the parts of the field that are more aligned with psychology and philosophy. These supposed soft sciences get buried by the hard sciences like chemistry and biology, which are seen as the only kind of science that matters in a medical model world. This serves to delegitimize many of the soft sciences, which often provide a critique of the society that we live in, and offer solutions to deal with that critique, pushing the idea that society could be at fault for anything further into obscurity, and uplifting an idea that all problems are caused by biology and chemistry. The chemical imbalance theory creates a very specific narrative around mental illness, a narrative that serves to uplift the status quo and obscure many of the actual causes of mental illness.
I'm happy man. Can feel it inside.
That Zoloft Blob ad originally aired in 2001 and stopped airing sometime in 2005. It's been off the air for over 20 years now. Even when it first aired, the theory it proposed was considered bunk. That didn't stop it from being the predominant way to explain mental illness, even with think pieces saying that psychiatrists knew the whole time that it was wrong. And with some psychiatrists even saying that no well-informed member of their profession would promote the theory was still widely promoted by the medical establishment, along with pharmaceutical ads, textbooks, and research articles. Even today, after its supposed death in 2022, it is still a widely believed and widely circulated myth. It's a myth that has made people feel like mental illness is an unchanging monolith, a biological curse. It moves people away from societal and personal change, and towards an uncritical view of the world around them. It is harmful, and it continues to be harmful. Thank you for making it to the end of this video. I hope it imparted some kind of wisdom. I want to thank all of my friends who gave feedback on parts or the whole of the script, including Junwoo, Carson, and Julian. I also want to thank everyone who reached out to me on Reddit, as well as Dr. Phillips, who gave me the idea for this in the first place. And of course, I want to thank my partner Luna for always being a main source of support and giving her feedback on the video. Thank you all so much.